Anyways, that's some of the ideas. Moving on to our next speaker. We also have another interesting speaker for this panel. Her name is Zalina Shamhudin. Well done. I get lucky sometimes with these names. She has over a decade and a half of experience working in investment banking, analyzing investment projects, and also 3 years working for the investment promotion agency in Thailand. Recently, she's been working at Sunway University in Thailand. So she has a wealth of experience, and we're very interested to see what she has to add to the discussion. Thank you. I don't know. Where can we change? I can change them if you want. Is it on here? Okay. Do you want to speak up there, or?
Hi. Do you want me to I'm giving you a different perspective because I'm not a policymaker, nor have had any experience doing policy, nor have I done extensive research into these issues. My role predominantly was for 3 years. In the last 3 years, I was part of a team that sold these policies. We sold the investment promotions, we sold those incentives, and asked MNCs to join us. So fundamentally, I was with an agency that was in Malaysia, and we were selling Kuala Lumpur, the city. But in the process of selling the city, obviously we had to sell the country as well. So I'm just going to give you a perspective from a salesperson's point of view, how challenging it is to actually make policies to encourage FDI, and what are the challenges it is when you're making these policies. And a lot of my views are based on my discussions with policymakers in terms of how policies need to be tweaked to actually move on with times. I must confess, I changed the slides at 6 o'clock in the morning. So whatever you've got printed out there may be in a very different order. So just, if you don't mind, if we could just go with the flow. Oh, wrong place. There you go. This first slide is essentially to show how Malaysia has done well in the global value chain and the development of the global value chain and Malaysia's participation in it. As you can see, in terms of value-added activities, in terms of our participation, we have over 68% of our total exports are value-added. We have ranked 7th of all the top 25 exporting countries, and we've also ranked 3rd in the developing countries. So fundamentally, what it means is whatever policies we've had as a country since the 1960s have worked. We've had sufficient success. We've done quite well, but as we go on further on in the slides, you realize that the government has actually taken a stand back and looked at our successes and actually evaluated it critically to figure out whether these successes were sustainable, whether they have moved with time, and whether policies need to actually change to reflect the changes in the global environment. Fundamentally, as mentioned earlier, what are the factors that actually make global value chain grow? Why would a company leave its own home base in the security of its own home base and move to a foreign country and set up and invest significant amount of money and set up something? One of the primary reasons in today's world of making money is to save costs. That's how Asia grew. It was a cheap source of labor. It was a cheap source of access to raw materials. And that's how Asia grew. And that's how Malaysia grew. We had access to raw materials. We had oil. we had palm oil, we had rubber, we were neighbors to countries that had other raw materials, and so in that sense, we were a very ideal location to be part of the global value chain. That's one. One is the cost. And another thing would be, I'm sorry, I'm trying to work two laptops at the same time. Low cost and proximity, going back to that. So in terms of how we did as a country is, obviously, that's how we leveraged. When we started out with our independence, we realized that these were our two selling factors, and we put in investment policies to encourage companies on that basis. And how do we benefit from this? As you can see, in terms of FDI, we have substantially grown year on year in terms of the FDI we've garnered as a country. But there are two factors here. Whenever a policymaker puts in investment policies to encourage foreign direct investment, the top question that you keep asking yourself is, will this crowd out the domestic players? How will this affect the domestic guys? Because at the end of the day, you've got limited resources, you've got limited talent. If a foreign guy comes in, promises higher wages, even if it's, $100 US, it's significantly higher, what will happen to the local players? So this was a major concern when investment policies were put in place. So as a country, we recognized the need to be part of the global value chain. We recognized the need of why we needed foreign companies to come into the country, but however, we had to manage the balance to make sure that our domestic players did not suffer significantly. As you can see from the blue chart, that we were quite lucky in terms of our policies because we had a dual policy strategy. We had policies to encourage foreign direct investment, but we also had policies to grow our local players. One of the things that helped us, the benefits that we tend to focus on when we come up with investment policies and trade policies to encourage foreign participation is the belief that these are the benefits that we will get as a country, right? The first one is, it's not a generation of employment. It's a generation of high income employment. Because that's the only way the economy and the country will grow if the general level of income increases. And the belief was that foreign companies would be able to provide that high income employment. The second thing is one works on the belief that there's going to be a transfer of skills and technology when these more developed companies come in, and as they're doing their work here in our country, there is some element of transfer of skills, transfer of technology to the local talent, and thereby the local players benefit from that as well. And again, the main theme of how foreign direct investment was encouraged was because the local ecosystem, the local suppliers grow as well. And like mentioned just now, that's how Intel and Penang grew. It started off with one company, and the whole ecosystem grew around it. And we have a lot of local players that are significantly global players today because of one Intel. And I'd just like to finish off by giving you an example of 3 top companies, local companies, that have done well because of these because of these investment policies. The first one is Straits Orthopedic. This is in the medical devices industry. Straits Orthopedic started off as a toll manufacturer for medical device companies, American medical device companies. And so what's happened now is Straits Orthopedic has developed the talent and developed its own technology that last year it went into a joint venture with a Chinese company that had a patent for a medical device, and that patent has been transferred to Malaysia, and they're developing that product for the global market. So that's Straits Orthopedics. This is in Penang, by the way. Sapurna Kencana, this is another one of our industries that have done very well. This is the oil and gas industry. So as you know, Malaysia had a huge reserve of oil and gas, which saw all the major players coming into Malaysia to explore. However, what they found was they needed a lot of subcontractors, a lot of engineering services that needed to be provided on the ground, rather than bringing in, and so historically what used to happen was all these engineers and all these special technical skills were brought in from abroad. The government then recognized that there was a gap, and the government started focusing on creating engineers for the oil and gas industry. Sampurna Kencana is a merger of two of these Malaysian companies, and today Sampurna Kencana has 12,000 employees and are based in over 20 countries globally. The last one that I wanted to mention is Strand. Strand is actually a UK company that does design for the aerospace industry. So they started off in Malaysia about 10 years ago with a local partner, just to explore the domestic market. Historically, you'll find that a lot of foreign MNCs that come to Malaysia tend to come in with the strategy of just exploiting the domestic market. They don't see Malaysia as a regional play. But what happened was the government went into discussions with Strand, and they said that they would support them if they could train over 1,000 engineers for the aerospace industry. And what happened was eventually the Strand company was bought over by a Malaysian entity. It's purely a Malaysian entity now. And with the government support, they have sufficiently trained engineers to be over 1,000 in number. And today, Strand is one of the major engineering support companies for Boeing. So in that sense, our policies have worked. We have grown our domestic players to a significant level as well. This is just a quick overview on our policies since independence. And to just give you a reflection on how the shift of policy happened. So as you can see, as soon as independence started, the whole point of these investment policies and trade policies were to reduce our dependence as a country on imports. And then we then recognized that we had huge resources, but we just did not have the skills to develop these resources. So investment policies were put in place to encourage foreign companies to come in. And predominantly it was in the manufacturing side, hoping that the transfer of talent and transfer of technology would help the Malaysian government as well. Towards the late 1990s and 2000, we suddenly realized that the benefits, year-on-year growth from manufacturing was not as good as in the earlier years. And that made the government actually reflect on its policies and figure out what was happening. And fundamentally, what happened was our investment policies were put in place in the early 1960s and have been tweaked during the 1970s and 1980s. But in the late 1990s and 2000 onwards, there was a huge shift in global value chains. There was suddenly a tremendous growth. Asia was in everyone's view. They were not only looking at it as a source of raw materials, but it was also reflected as a source of consumption. The biggest two populations are here in Asia. So the whole view for Asia was changing. And there were other countries in Asia that were growing besides the usual suspects of Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. So in that sense, the government realized that policies needed to be changed. So they put into place a policy called the Economic Transformation Program, which I'll explain a bit further on if you don't mind. But this slide essentially to show the progression in terms of our policies from a pure import substitution to a manufacturing base, focusing on services, and now how our shift in terms of activities that we're focusing on have shifted over the years. This is a situational analysis. Now, this gives you a good benchmark as to why we needed to change our policies as a country, right? By 2005, Malaysia had built itself a reputation for being a manufacturing base for E&E. It had built a reputation for outsourced shared services. We had done tremendously well in these two activities. But these two activities had very low value add. So whether the country had actually benefited from the real impact of global value chains was being debated. As you can see, we didn't have much R&D being done in Malaysia. We didn't have supply chain management being done in Malaysia, and talent development was not something that foreign companies were actively doing in Malaysia. So fundamentally, when we had to relook at our strategies, we realized two things. The value add was just not happening. We were not garnering the kind of success that we wanted to garner. And two is we were getting competition from our neighboring countries that were doing much better now with time. And so Malaysia actually had to sit up and relook at its policies and figure out how we could improve. And that's how we came up with the Economic Transformation Program. The Economic Transformation Program had 12 focuses. Of that 12, 11 were industry focuses, leveraging on the industries that we were doing well in, that we had a competitive advantage in, and we felt that we had potential to grow in. And the 12th one was actually a location focus. That was where Kuala Lumpur came into play. Based on a lot of statistics, we found that selling a country, it's much easier to sell a city. In Asia, the two primary cities that were seen as global cities were Singapore and Hong Kong. However, Singapore and Hong Kong had reached a stage they were becoming too expensive to be considered viable options going forward. So we felt there was a great niche for us to develop Kuala Lumpur as a regional play. And that's how it happened. And this was the 12 policies that were put in place. Now, the other significant difference in these policies were that they were focusing on a shift in the activities that were focused. So the investment policies would be there for manufacturing, for shared services, but the investment promotion agencies like us, we had to be a bit more discerning who we sold it to. So if we were to sell it to company XYZ, we would not sell it if it was purely an assembly production plant. We would insist on a level of R&D. We would insist on a level of high income employment. We would give targets for the number of jobs that would be created. We would give targets in terms of the technology that would be transferred. So we started giving more targets in exchange for investment policies. So that's how the whole shift happened for us. What I wanted to do with this slide is actually bring your focus to one particular industry and to show how that shift happened. So essentially, as mentioned just now, Penang is our great hub for E&E. We started off as a purely assembly plant, and most of the European and American companies came in the 1970s and set up the assembly plants to leverage of low labor costs. However, when we realized there was low value add and there was no significant training of our local talent, we shifted the incentives in such a way that we only offered incentives where there was more R&D involved, where there was more high-tech development of products involved. We weren't interested in the components. We weren't interested, not that we didn't welcome it, we welcomed them, but we gave more benefits to those companies that brought in more add value to us as a country. So in terms of participation strategy, besides investment policies, besides incentives, tax credit and 10-year no paying tax, fundamentally it's all cost to us as a country. And at the end of the day, that's not enough. It's not enough just saying, okay, I'm going to give you a tax credit and I'm going to give you, I'll cover your tax bill for the next 20 years, because that's actually not enough to be a participant in a global value chain play. There are other factors that are critical as well. For example, custom duty exemptions. At the end of the day, as a country, you have to realize your borders are blurred now. You are part of a bigger picture. So you can't have protective custom duty exemptions, because if you're going to make it difficult for products to come in and products to exit the country, then no matter how many investment policies, how many tax incentives you give, it's just not viable. Just as mentioned just now with the trade zone in India. Yeah? Domestic investment initiatives. Besides encouraging foreign companies to come in, sufficient funds have to be put aside to grow the domestic players as well. You got to make sure the growth of foreign participation and domestic players are in tandem as well. And lastly, I feel that one of the strong points to how Malaysia did well was because we do have industrial-led states. We do have industrial-free zones, and a lot of foreign companies actually leverage on that because that makes a huge difference to them. So we felt that these are the other factors besides incentives that are critical when you're trying to encourage global value chain participation. This is just an example of how we have succeeded. Now, this company, as you can tell, I drew this at 6 o'clock in the morning. This company started off in the 1970s as a pure manufacturing play. Came in low-cost assembly. They used up raw materials locally, predominantly palm oil. They manufactured the palm oil, and everything was shipped to the global headquarters in Europe. And from there, it was transmitted to their customers in the various regions. So that was how it was done about 20, 30 years ago. But with the help of the government, well, I wouldn't say help, with the partnership with the government of Malaysia, today, they have 4 factories in Asia. All 4 factories are then controlled by a regional headquarters sitting here in Kuala Lumpur. The regional headquarters does procurement for all 4 local factories. It does operational shared services globally. We are the shared services center. We are also the distribution center whereby all the products from the various 4 factories are centralized and in Malaysia and redistributed to clients. And we also manage all customers in Asia. And anything that has to go to Europe or the global headquarters is sent up from here. So as you can see, as a location in Malaysia, we've transformed ourselves and transformed the services and the kind of partnership we have with the company to develop the company and help the company grow in the region as well. Am I running out of time?
Yeah, you're doing well, actually.
Okay.
6, 7 minutes.
Okay, so what I'd like to finish off with is, I'd just like to mention is, what's the government's responsibility? What should we do as government policymakers to actually help global value chain grow and so that we can benefit from it as well? Besides incentives, which are the tax strategies, we need to have a conducive business environment. It's just not enough just giving tax incentives. You have to have a strong legal system. You've got to recognize that trade is critical. So you have to have the right infrastructure. And it doesn't mean that you have a port that can have 20,000 cranes and you have the depth of seas. You've got to have the services that goes with it. You've got to have the transportation, the logistics. You've got the roads. You've got to have the customs that's efficient. That's the whole infrastructure. You've got to have the whole package to make it a viable ecosystem to run a business. And next thing is, although you don't seem to believe in FTAs, in my opinion, I think they're really important. Yeah, I'm sure you have evidence, but from a seller's point of view, politician, I'm not a politician, but from a seller's point of view, these were one of the issues that a lot of companies, that when we approached them, it was important for them that they knew that the ASEAN trade agreement was going through. It was important for them that the TPP was going through. It was important that the ASEAN trade agreement with China happened, and with India happened, and with Japan happened, because at the end of the day, we're one market. The whole world is just one market. And if we're going to have barriers in terms of movement of trade, in terms of movement of talent, in terms of movement of capital, it just slows things down. And so my personal opinion is multi-trade relationships are very important, but clearly...
I agree. Not
okay. Okay, and investment policies. This again is based on Malaysia's experience. We were very much focused on building up manufacturing and hoping to get that kind of value add from those policies. However, we have realized that we need to adapt to the change. Manufacturing is not the be-all and end-all of everything. There's a strong growth in the services industries as well. So investment policies have to change to recognize that. You have to change and recognize the fact that you can't expect a company to come in and say, okay, I'll give you the whole value chain because you're doing me a favor, let me do you a favor. Governments have to be a little bit more selective in who we give the policy, give the incentives to. And we also need to do a bit of negotiating and bargaining as well. We have to demand things back in process as well. And that's something that I feel is quite critical. And lastly is we got to stop competing with each other as countries. Recognize your strength, focus on your strength, and create a niche. If Singapore's going to be a financial center, fine, but it's a financial center for personal wealth management. Malaysia can then become a financial center for Islamic finance. Hong Kong can then be a center for international banking. So, you know, it defeats the whole point of competing. We've all got niches. Just focus on your niche, and that's how you should go forward. My last slide. I've told you what governments need to do. Now, my last point is based on my experience. We've dealt with a lot of companies, and you know, it's hard selling your country when you've got a neighboring country that's willing to offer more, who's got deeper pockets, who's got more labor, who's more cost competitive. So you know, you're at this end and you feel that you don't have much bargaining power. But at the end of the day, one of the reflections I took away from my experience was most of these companies are making a lot of money out of us as a country. They won't come to our country unless it makes financial sense to them too. And in my opinion, I think it has to be a partnership. It really has to be a partnership. Companies need to recognize that we as a country are helping them grow and develop. They should help us as a country grow and develop as well. There should be a clear transfer of technology, a clear skill transfer as well. Secondly is companies should move away from profit shifting. Global value chain can only do well and develop well and be successful and sustainable if they recognize that it's economic sense. You're not doing it to just make profit, but it makes economic sense. You must have substance, and you must have a reason for being based in a country besides just benefiting from lower tax rates. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.